Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues brings expert guests to the airwaves to talk through your divorce questions and fill in the gray areas about separating. From thinking about divorce to how to behave during divorce to what to do after, this is Divorce Dialogue. Welcome to Divorce Dialogues. I'm Catherine Miller. I'm the founder of the Miller Law Group and a trainer at the Center for Understanding in Conflict, and I am on a mission to change how people divorce and help them divorce with dignity. And my guest today is Ed Vargo. He's the founder of Burning River Advisory Group, and his passion for women's financial empowerment was shaped by witnessing his immigrant mother's struggles as she navigated life in America without financial literacy or independence. A Cleveland native and a proud father of 5 daughters, Ed has dedicated his career to providing a compassionate financial guidance that helps women achieve true independence and equality through financial strength. Welcome, Ed Varga, to my show.
Thanks for having me.
So, in your bio, you talk about witnessing your mother's journey through divorce as a first generation immigrant. And I'm wondering how that experience shaped your understanding of the unique challenges she and women face when contemplating divorce.
Yeah, it's had a huge impact in terms of the trajectory of my business and in particular of how we work and approach divorce. So my mom was married to my father for about 17 years. She came over from Korea, never, and still to this day, doesn't read the language, write the language, has never driven a car. And
Oh,
so she was obviously operating against some pretty heavy headwinds when it comes to divorce. So just a basic language barrier, being able to understand the culture and how to get access to information. And when I was younger, of course, I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea what that was like for her, looking at it from the childhood eyes of somebody who was 9 or 10 years old. As I've gotten older and certainly more aware of the world at large, I've come to really appreciate how difficult that must have been for her. Being this woman, 4 kids in a at this point not so strange land, but still strange from where she came from, and then having to navigate this difficult divorce process and not really knowing where to start. And unfortunately, she really didn't know how to effectively navigate the divorce system. And so she ended up giving up custody of her 4 children. She thought that was her only out. She didn't understand the idea of alimony or child support or those types of things. I don't know the perspective from my father's perspective in terms of whether he offered that up. My guess not. But the reality was that she had to give up full custody of her 4 kids and create that gap in our relationship and of course that hole in her heart, so to speak, of having to do something so drastic. And of course that guides me today in the sense, I guess I shouldn't say of course, but it guides me today because I look back on that and I think about how awful that must have been for her. Here's my mom who had to give up custody of her 4 children, the nearest and dearest things to her heart, because she didn't have the wherewithal, the knowledge or financial wherewithal to be able to provide for us, or at least that was her thought at the time. And it really guides me because I have these 5 young ladies now in my life, and I don't want them to ever have to experience something or anything close to what my mother had experienced. And I take that same mindset into our work with clients. I mean, we advocate for women. We predominantly work with women in our practice, and we are their true advocates because, and I think largely I feel so strongly about this because of how my mindset has been shaped by what my mother went through.
Eduardo, you said so much there about your mother's journey that I think is relevant for anyone facing divorce, especially someone who doesn't feel like they have the full information. Or even if they feel like they have the full information, they don't have the full information. They don't know what they don't know. And so there's financial literacy there, right? Financial understanding, but there's also understanding about the law and what the elements of it are. And it's one of the reasons for this show, really, is to educate people about the divorce process so that they have a better understanding of everything to ask about, right? And so it sounds like you have really dedicated your career to helping to educate people on financial literacy, financial questions, understanding money, understanding what resources are. And so as a parent, you mentioned your kids. I have 5 kids too. Mine are older now, not all girls, 3 girls and 2 boys. And I think that when as parents, we take on responsibility for teaching our kids about so many things. What do you think is important to, as for a parent to teach their child about money so that it doesn't become a situation where they don't know what they don't know?
Yeah, that's a big question. I look at it from the lens of mothers talking to daughters primarily. What I'm about to talk to, I'm sure applies to mothers or fathers to sons. It really doesn't matter of the gender, but my I think there are some headwinds that women face that men don't. And we may or may not get into those today, but when it comes to parents talking to their children, I think it's important that parents understand and can impress upon their kids that talking about money and actually seeking money and wanting to be good with it is not a bad thing. We shouldn't have any negative connotations around wanting to make money or be good at how we handle money, those types of things. I think sometimes we look at, those who have money or the pursuit of money in a negative light. Like it brings out a bad quality in you because you're going after money. And I don't think that's true at all. I know money in and of itself is inert, it's neutral. It's what values you bring to that money that matter most. So if we start with the right values and we can apply those values to how we use money, I think that's the most important part of it. Meaning we've all seen bad behavior of people with money. They're rich and powerful with money. We've seen that bad behavior, but we see really good behavior with that money as well. When you have more dollars at your disposal, you could be more generous. You could be more giving. You can take care of more people. That's a great use of money. I mean, we should celebrate that. And even if you don't have to pursue a lot of money, just don't look at it from a negative perspective. And I think there's a lot of that pervasive in today's world where people are looking at going after money or even just being good with money as being a negative thing. So we've got to overcome that barrier because if we associate negativity with financial knowledge or understanding or pursuit, how likely are we to go and get good at it? Probably not that likely. And if you're not good with money, again, small money, big money, if you're not good with the money you have, it's just going to create some headwinds and some obstacles that you don't really need to overcome. And I think that's the biggest thing. I would talk to kids about money in a positive light. I would model good money behavior, even more so than talking about it in the sense of like, I have a one-way conversation with me and my child, or even if it's a two-way conversation, oftentimes when they're younger, they really don't know about money and how to think about, they don't know what $100,000 is versus 20,000 versus a million. They really don't have that perspective to discern between the differences. And so talking about money too, like getting too specific around money can be counterproductive because it can just turn kids off because they don't really understand it. But I would model good behavior if you believe I'll give you an example. We believe that spending money on experiences and doing things is more important than spending money on buying stuff. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with buying stuff and having a nice car, nice house, the latest iPhone. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever. Our value system says, yeah, I'd rather put that money into going on a trip. I'd rather put that money into buying something that allows us to spend time together, go to the theater together, things of that nature. And so we model that behavior, and we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about it. It's just what we do, it's how we live and how we operate. And when you do it that way, your kids will naturally pick up on that. So I think the biggest thing is not being afraid to talk about money and to celebrate or at least talk about it in the positive way, and then to model the behavior that you would like to see in your kids when it comes to money.
Ed, you said a minute or so ago that money is inert, and yet it is such a power and influence. It's a way that we use money to measure success and power and measure ourselves against our families of origin, our neighbors, our friends, and each other. And money impacts people in relationships. I'm sure you see that all the time. And so how do you see that in the work that you do, the impact that money has in relationships, and how to think about money in regards to relationship changes, people getting married? We're in the middle of what I think of as prenup season now. People thinking about getting married in the spring and the summer are thinking about talking about prenuptial agreements. And then, of course, there's people who are thinking about how money is influenced in their divorces. So, what do you think about money with regard to the change in relationship?
Well, money is a very powerful force because it's fungible. And what I mean by fungible, it can be readily turned into something else. And something that is highly fungible is highly valuable. And money is probably the most fungible thing out there. So imagine if you have a lot of money, you can turn that into a lot of things. You can gain knowledge, you can gain time, you can gain influence. You have the ability to do so many things when you have so much money, which is where the power comes in. Money's not powerful in and of itself. It's powerful because you can turn that money into so many things. And because you can turn it into so many things, it's incredibly valuable. So I have like a Yeti coffee mug here. It's probably 20 bucks. Well, I mean, $20 is way more valuable than this coffee mug because I can only take that coffee mug and do so many things with it. But that 20 bucks, I can turn that into a ton of different things. And so the thing about money is when you have more of it, you have more power for sure. And so there's this old adage that money corrupts. I think power corrupts, but money can help you get power. But it doesn't have to be that way at all. And so again, when I say it's inert, it's neutral, it really is. And I think when you have money, what value system do you bring to that money really tells the tale. And I think money has a tendency of exposing more of who you already are than anything else. Now, that you take that concept and you take it into a relationship. Each person comes into that relationship with a different mindset around money. How you grew up, did you come from money? Did you not come from money? What influenced you? And so you have two people coming into this relationship with very different experiences and very different relationships with money. And that's where a lot of the problems come in. Now, we think about money very differently, and people don't talk about money. I mean, when's the last time how often do you hear people sit down and really get into the fabric of, well, how did you grow up and how did your money situation influence how you think about the world at large today, how you think about how to use money in your life today? Nobody does that. People just kind of go about their business. They spend money however they spend it. It usually is not a source of conflict, and not enough so early in a relationship to where it's noticeable. But the deeper you get into a relationship and the longer you're in those relationships, what tends to happen, and this is where I think the problems start to come in, if you get into, if you're in a partnership and say you're living together, there's a natural division of labor in the household, right? Not each person doesn't do exactly the same chores or has the same duties. You kind of settle into a comfortable, normal sense of normalcy. You do what you like, what you're good at, and you just figure that out. And money becomes a part of that. And what tends to happen with money is that women are less comfortable with money on average, less confident with money than their male counterparts. And there's a lot of reasons for that, again, beyond the scope of today's conversation, but there's this naturally where the guy raises his hand and said, hey, I'll handle this big picture money thinking, and I'll handle that stuff. You're busy, you can handle some of this other stuff. And women are very eager or open to saying, yeah, that's fine, because they don't want to deal with it anyway. And that creates a power dynamic shift in the relationship. And so the person who has more knowledge about money, and if men, I know this is certainly less true today than ever before, but in a relationship where the man makes more money and has control over the money, that power dynamic shifts dramatically. And it can work fine that way if the relationship is fine and if you are both going in the same direction values wise and your dollars are going towards the things that you value most. It starts to become problematic when the person with the money basically starts to rule over, how the money should be spent in the household, and that creates a lot of conflict. Worst case, the relationship ends and you're in a divorce situation, and then this is a real problem like it was for my mother. If you don't know about the money, you don't have control over the money or access to the money, and you're trying to go through a divorce process, which is about dividing up money and doing it right, you're at a huge disadvantage when you're in that situation. And so, in this minute, I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but the reality is that the way to bridge that gap is you need to have both parties come to the table, talk about money on a regular basis. It doesn't mean you both have to manage it. Just you can still have that division of labor, but you can't, unlike a lot of the other, duties at home, you can't just push it off to somebody else and not be involved at all. With money, it's not a typical chore at the household. It's not like cutting the grass or cleaning up the house or doing those. It's not the same. You need to be involved on some meaningful way so you know what's going on, even if you're not the one doing it.
I'm Catherine Miller, and you're listening to Divorce Dialogues, a podcast dedicated to educating people about divorce related topics so everyone can divorce with dignity. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts to be sure that you don't miss an episode. And I'm talking today with Ed Vargo about empowerment, relationships, and women and money and how they impact each other. And, I think you just said, Ed Vargo, that people, you can't just ignore the money, but sometimes people do because it's stressful. Sometimes the idea of, well, you know what, I don't want to deal with that, or he wants to deal with that, and I don't really want to make a fuss about it. It makes me anxious anyway. So we're just going to do this, and I'm just going to charge up groceries or whatever, clothes for the kids and at the Gap or wherever you shop, and not really think about where our money is invested or what our retirement plan is and all of that sort of stuff. And I get this happens all the time. The woman will say, and this is very, it could be the other way. And I think more and more we do have a change in the traditional rules around this, but the woman will say, I didn't know anything about the money. And the husband will say, every year I went over the financial plan. Like I wasn't hiding anything. And this sort of the sense of mystery and an effort to be sharing those duties really impacts the relationship, right? And so that, regardless of whether or not who's doing what, that there be a plan that includes both people's priorities, I think is what you're saying, right? So you said toward the beginning of the show that your family prioritizes experiences over material possessions. I'm reframing a little bit, but right?
Mhm.
Right?
Yep.
As opposed to another family that might say, nice cars is what we want, or a nice house is what we want, or having us a vacation house is what we want, or, whatever it is. But if you don't really think about what we as a family, an economic unit as a family want to do, then there's a very likelihood of having tension in the relationship because one person wants experiences and another person want nice things. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on with that. It creates a lot of conflict because if you have competing objectives, there's conflict. And then how do you bridge that gap? And a lot of times one party just steamrolls the other. And sometimes and it doesn't have to be as dramatic as that, like you have a nefarious male or a nefarious female steamrolling their partner. It could just be a silent partner who isn't comfortable speaking up and basically never gets his or her way because she doesn't or he doesn't speak up and that tends to be more in the relationships. Men do tend to be in charge of the money, the big picture, not the day-to-day expenses. Like we've done tons and tons of studies, or tons of studies out there. Women tend to control the pocketbook, the purse, the day-to-day spending, and men tend to control the big picture decisions. Where to invest, what homes are we gonna buy, those types of things. And so if you have this disconnect in terms of objectives and you're not talking about it and no dialogue is being had, well, one party's going to step up and take control. And you do that long enough, it creates resentment. It's certainly misalignment in the relationship and a lot of disharmony. And a lot of it can be fixed through having dialogue. Now, it is true that there could be some conflict when you have that dialogue, right? Because you're not seeing things eye to eye, but that's the nature of relationships. You can't just sweep it under the rug because it's just not good for the relationship. And so having maybe a difficult conversation done in the right way, coming to an agreement, and then revisiting this over time because values change, situations and circumstances change all the time. And you just can't put your head in the sand and just hope it all is going to work out because it usually doesn't work out.
Most of the people who are listening to this show are in a situation where it's not working out. And that's why they're listening to the show. This show is called Divorce Dialogues. So for someone who maybe did not educate herself as much about the money as she should have, whether or not that was because of her own actions or her spouse's actions or some combination thereof or the busyness of life or whatever. What is your advice and guidance to that person thinking about or in the process of divorce to educate herself or himself about what the family finances are facing divorce?
Well, it's just that you have to get educated about everything that you have financially. And you really need to know all that you own and all that you owe, both parties. It's not simple. I mean, it's simple in concept, but it's not simple in practice and application. And a lot of times you'll have someone who's like, I don't even know where to start. And that is a tough spot to be in because you feel a bit helpless. You can oftentimes feel helpless in a situation like that. I really think getting good counsel, finding the right professional. I call them do you have your dream team, your divorce dream team? Do you have them put together? You have your professional side of that dream team and you have the personal side. And on the professional side, I think it's a three-legged stool of the divorce attorney, who I think is the most important cog in the machine, if you will, the financial advisor who's trained in divorce, and then the mental health professional. Because divorce is a legal process, but it's heavily influenced by the financial. They go hand in glove. And of course, the mental health side is so important because if you're not in the best space emotionally and mentally to deal with this very difficult and very complicated situation, you're probably going to make mistakes. And so finding the right team is so important. An attorney who will advocate for you, I mean, truly advocate for you, listen to you, and you work well with. A financial advisor who understands the divorce side. And in this particular instance, your financial advisor would be the person that you would lean on more heavily to help you understand the scope of what's going on, to help you understand what documents do you need, what is this document mean versus that document. When you're going through a settlement process and you're trying to figure out what's fair from settlement, that the attorney and the financial advisor can work closely to develop a strategy and a plan that makes the most sense. And the client doesn't have to feel like she's got to do this all herself. She has to learn everything. She doesn't. And it's really, in a divorce situation, it's very difficult to learn all the stuff that you need to learn on the fly without professional help. And the more money you have and the more complicated your financial situation is, the more true that becomes. I mean, if you have a very simple case, you hardly have any assets, etc., then what I just said doesn't apply nearly as much. But I find that most people, even with modest means, have an imbalance of information. And so you really just got to get knowledgeable about it and find the right people to help you do it.
Yeah, being the child of divorce, right, and having grown up with your dad and seen your mom struggle, what that really gives you, I think, and working with divorcing people gives you a really multifaceted uh, view of the divorce process. And how does that perspective help you when, as a member of a team of professionals helping a client through the divorce process? How does that help you help them with the financial elements of the separation?
Well, I think what it does, it helps me better understand their position. My mom was in an extreme situation where she had no idea of what was going on and had a language barrier and my father was a fairly dominating personality. He didn't even have much money. That really wasn't an issue. But even despite that, I mean, if we didn't have money, I don't even know if it would have turned out any differently if we had money. That coming up from that sort of extreme perspective and then carrying it forward into my conversations with the women that we represent, it just, the reality is I only have so much time I get to spend with these clients, right? In a meeting and in a conversation. So I'm trying to extrapolate from those conversations what they're going through. And it's hard to do that. It can be particularly hard to do that, especially in a scenario where if I didn't have that experience with my mom, I don't know if I would be as appreciative and as empathetic toward what's actually happening there. Not that you have to have those types of experience to show empathy and to really put yourself in their shoes. I don't necessarily believe you have to have a lived experience for that to be the case. But in my case, it certainly helped. And I understand that for most of the women, and I don't want to say all, but for most of the women that we've come in contact with, none of them have been out there to try and take the other party. They're not there to try and take him for everything he's got or any of those types of things. They just want to move on with their life. They want to be in a position to take care of themselves, take care of their families, and just live a good life from here. And that's what my mom wanted. I mean, she certainly wasn't trying to get over on my father. And she thought she was making the best decision for us. And I think in hindsight, if we had a chance to do it all over again, we would do it a different way because it would have been better for us to have shared custody, for my mom to have shared custody. in that case, not to give up complete control. But she didn't know any better and she thought that was the right way to do it. So, part of what we do is try to help women not be too magnanimous, not to be too giving in the divorce process, not to be too trusting, and to really learn how to advocate for themselves and their families, maybe for the first time ever. And it's not an easy thing to do because my experience with women and with moms in particular, my mom and my wife and how she interacts with our kids, I know she'd do anything for those kids. She'll do for the kids before she would do for herself. And I don't think that's unique to Wendy. And so in the divorce process, you see that tendency to give to others, to think the best of others, even during some of the most difficult times of their lives, can work against you. So that's why us in the advocate role, I really prefer that role. We can serve. We're collaboratively divorce trained, so we can serve as a financial neutral in cases and not really represent a party, but the process. Honestly, I've tried it both ways. I would rather represent the party. I want to represent the woman, and I want to be in a position to advocate for her because sometimes women can't advocate for themselves in the way that they really need to.
You're listening to the Divorce Dialogues podcast, and I'm Catherine Miller. Divorce Dialogues has been educating people about divorce and relationship issues for over 10 years, about 12 years now. Subscribe to the podcast and don't forget to check out our previous episodes on the podcast website, divorcedialogues.com. And I'm talking today with Ed Vargo about relationships and money and divorce, and particularly with regard to women. So, Ed, if people want to learn more about you, get in contact, or have some questions for you, how can they do that?
And the best ways is to go to our website. I actually have two companies. My primary business is called Burning River Advisory Group. That's my wealth management business. And you just go to burningriveraG.com. We started a sister company up. We're just getting this one off the ground called Enlighten Her. And Enlighten Her is a community for financial education and coaching for women. It's sort of big tent. We're trying to get the information and knowledge that we have out to the world at large. And so if you're kind of new to the finance space and you want to learn more about it, I would go to enlightenher.com. There's some great white papers on there. There's a great piece about the 9 money myths that women face. There's another piece about some women going through divorce and the 12 steps that you can take. I think there's really good resources on Enlighten Her. That would be the primary place for new information, and the blog, we're getting that up and running. So I would definitely check us out on enlightenher.com.
That Enlighten Her sounds like a really terrific resource for people who are women, particularly thinking about the divorce process or feeling like, oh, maybe I need to get more information, start to educate myself a little bit more around money issues. Ed Vargo, one of the things that I have noticed over the years is that oftentimes women are really focused on maintaining the family home. And that from a financial perspective, that could be challenging or even perhaps ill-advised. And I'm wondering what your experience is with that and what you think about it.
I think you're absolutely right. It can be challenging and oftentimes it is ill-advised. And it's easy to understand why. I mean, if you think about, a woman who's raised her kids in that home, typically they want stability for their children, or if they don't have children, for themselves. It's the community that they live in. Their relationships are founded there. And so there's a really strong emotional pull to remain in the home. And if you can accomplish that financially, of course, that would be great. That would be the way to do it. What tends to happen and where it can go awry is when we start to overemphasize the home, being in the home, and we don't look at it with as discerning eyes as we should. Because at the end of the day, in the divorce process, there's a splitting of assets, and they're going to assign values to these assets. And they don't necessarily, when I say they, basically that's how the divorce process works. And so if you have, just for the sake of round numbers, you have $1 million estate, divorce assets on the table, 500,000 wrapped up in the house, 500,000 in retirement plans. On paper, they look exactly the same. So the husband might say, you can keep the home, keep the $500,000 home, and then I'll keep the assets. But they're not the same. On paper they are, but they're not the same. So the woman has the home, gets the stability that she was looking for. However, she also gets all of the stuff that comes with owning a home like that. You don't have liquidity in the asset. It doesn't grow like the investments on the other hand. So your flexibility is really diminished. you're tethered to this home. And this is where the term house rich, cash poor comes from. You're rich in home. I'm living in a great place, but you might be cash poor. And so your ability to do other things might be severely impeded. And a lot of times, what ends up happening is women are forced to sell the home later, and sometimes at significant cost. And so financially, they end up worse off. So the idea is to come at this with more discerning eyes, understand what is really happening here financially, and see if there's another way to do it. If you can't stay in the exact same home, is there a way to stay in the community? You need to rent for a little while you get your ducks in a row. You really want to put all options on the table, think through them one by one. And then ultimately, if the decision is, yeah, being in the marital home, that's the right decision, great. You've taken all the steps, you've thought about it from the right angles, and that was the conclusion you made. What tends to happen, though, tends to be a heavily emotionally driven decision. You start with the conclusion, and then you backfill with the information to make that the only option, and that's a good way to get into trouble.
Yeah. And how do you work with women or men, I suppose, who are really facing this problem to really understand the pros and cons of holding on to a piece of real estate like that versus some of the other options?
Yeah, and everything begins with what is important to you. What are your objectives in life? Where are you going from here? We always start with that because the money needs to support those objectives. And how much money you need and what way do you need that money, home versus, let's say, liquid asset, is contingent upon, what those goals and desires are. So we want to always begin with the end in mind, what's really important to you, and then work backward and just frame the conversation, because what tends to happen in divorce is people have all kinds of preconceived notions about how divorce works. And they get them from all different sources, from friends, from family, from the internet, from TV. We're all influenced by those sources, and we compile this image of what divorce is. And it's often very different from how the actual divorce process works. So what we can do is come in and frame the conversation and say, okay, this is the box that you need to play in. This is the sandbox, not what you thought. And once you can frame that conversation, oftentimes it starts to provide a clarity that wasn't there before. And instead of starting way left of center, you're maybe at center and moving closer to the ultimate objective, which is making good decisions. So it really is helping clients understand how this process works. What are the key levers that you have to focus in on? What are what we would call type one decisions, which are the irrevocable decisions in this process and the ones that really matter, and making sure that we focus on those, get those right, because in divorce, unfortunately, there are no do-overs. In essence, you got to get this right the first time.
Yeah, and we get those calls in my firm all the time. Oh, I'm not happy with the divorce agreement I signed last year. Can you help me? And I'm like, it's going to be really tough. Like the
Right.
time to put your hand up and say, I'm not happy with this is before you sign, not after you sign. So,
Yeah, and that's exactly why we got into this business, this part of the business, because we just kept seeing a bunch of women coming to us post settlement with what we thought was I don't know, unfair, disadvantageous divorce settlement, and every one of them had worked with an attorney. And so we were like, okay, we either are just gonna have to accept this as it is and just deal with these things that come to us, whether we like it or not, and pick up the pieces, or we could try to get out on the front end. And getting out on the front end is a much harder road to hoe for us. It was completely changing our business. But we felt really very strongly that if we would want to make real change, we've got to get out in front of this, get them earlier, get to women earlier, help them craft a better settlement, understand what they're getting into, and then, of course, thereby avoiding the problem. And that's why Enlighten Her was part of the reason Enlighten Her was created. We've actually created a program called the Divorce Navigator Program. It's designed for women it's a digital course designed for women who are either just have the first hint of thinking divorce might be in my future as a possibility, like there's a little crack in the relationship. And I think when you're at that stage, you want to get knowledgeable about what is this divorce thing, dispel all those preconceived notions, get on solid footing just to understand what this process looks like, because it's very different from what most people think. And then if it progresses from there, maybe the relationship is fine. You don't have to worry about it. And it just becomes a bit of knowledge that you gained, never needed. On the other hand, in many cases, it tends to morph and accelerate. And then you're at the stage of, okay, this is either happening or it's thrust upon you. And that's the second part of the program, which is, okay, this is happening. How do I do it the right way? And it's just about gaining the knowledge that you need to navigate a very difficult and complicated process. You're marrying the legal process with the financial process, which either of those things by itself is difficult. Put them together and it's exceedingly difficult. Oh, and by the way, you're
Not to mention a parenting plan.
exactly right. Not to mention all the other emotional stuff that comes with it, trying to be at your best. And if you have, children involved, you have that whole other element. And as you mentioned, a parenting plan and trying to make sure that your children are not damaged in the process. I mean, it is a lot. That's why there's so much press and consternation around divorce. It's just not easy.
No. On that note, thank you so much, Ed Vargo, for being my guest on Divorce Dialogues. It's been a really interesting and enlightening, if I do say, conversation.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate it.